My name is Claire Hamilton, and I am 34 years old. For the past 4 years, I've been what you might call the ghost in the machine at Silverline Consulting, a mid-tier strategy firm that somehow managed to punch above its weight class. I say somehow because I know exactly how. I was the shadow behind every major win, the unnamed architect of every breakthrough solution, the quiet force that kept million-dollar deals from falling apart at 3 in the morning. But ghosts, as it turns out, are only appreciated when they stay invisible. I started at Silverline as a junior analyst, fresh out of business school with more ambition than sense. Within 6 months, I'd redesigned their entire client assessment framework. Within a year, I'd developed the workflow system that became the backbone of their operations. By year 2, I was the person they called when everything was falling apart, which, at a company like Silverline, happened more often than anyone cared to admit. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was indispensable, yet completely dispensable. My direct supervisor, Martin Rouse, had perfected the art of taking credit for my work with the smooth efficiency of a seasoned pickpocket. Every presentation I crafted became his vision. Every strategy I developed became his innovation. Every client relationship I salvaged became his triumph. Martin was the kind of manager who wore his mediocrity like expensive cologne, heavily applied and impossible to ignore. He had a talent for making himself appear essential while contributing nothing of substance. His greatest skill was delegation, which is a polite way of saying he was exceptionally good at making other people do his job. His right hand was Dana Morrison, a woman whose loyalty to Martin bordered on the religious. Dana had been with Silverline for 8 years, climbing from receptionist to Martin's executive assistant through a combination of unwavering devotion and strategic information gathering. She knew everyone's secrets, everyone's schedules, and everyone's weak points. If Martin was the face of their little empire, Dana was the intelligence network that kept it running. I should have seen the writing on the wall when Dana started keeping a notebook during our team meetings. At first, I thought she was taking meeting minutes, a reasonable assumption for someone in her position. But then I noticed she only wrote when I spoke. Every question I asked, every suggestion I made, every time I arrived 5 minutes late because I'd been on a call with a client, it all went into that little black notebook. The first real crack in my facade of professional contentment came during the Merrick Industrials crisis. Merrick was our biggest client, a manufacturing giant that represented nearly 30% of Silverline's annual revenue. Their contract was up for renewal, and preliminary discussions had gone poorly. Our initial proposal had been rejected outright, with their CEO describing it as uninspired and overpriced. I spent a weekend locked in my apartment, surviving on coffee and takeout, completely reimagining our approach. Instead of trying to optimize their existing processes, I developed a comprehensive transformation strategy that would position them as an industry leader in sustainable manufacturing. I created detailed implementation timelines, cost-benefit analyses, and risk assessments. I even designed a pilot program that would demonstrate measurable results within the first quarter. Monday morning, I presented my work to Martin in his office. He flipped through the presentation with the casual interest of someone browsing a magazine in a waiting room. "This is solid work, Claire," he said, which was the closest thing to praise I'd received from him in months. "Let me review it and we'll discuss implementation." The next day, I watched from the back of the conference room as Martin delivered my presentation to the Merrick executives. He'd made minor cosmetic changes, different fonts, slightly reordered sections. But the core strategy, the innovative approaches, the carefully crafted arguments were all mine. The Merrick team was impressed. They signed a 3-year extension worth $8 million. That afternoon, Martin announced that Dana would be promoted to Senior Project Coordinator in recognition of her invaluable contributions to the Merrick renewal. I remained a Senior Strategic Analyst, the same position I'd held for 2 years. I said nothing. I smiled, congratulated Dana, and went back to my desk. But something had shifted inside me, a fundamental understanding of how this game was played. I wasn't a valued team member, I was a resource to be exploited. My silence wasn't professionalism, it was complicity in my own marginalization. The pattern continued with depressing regularity. The Morrison Bank efficiency audit that saved them $2 million annually. Martin's breakthrough methodology. The Hartwell Corp merger strategy that prevented a hostile takeover. Martin's innovative thinking. The cost reduction program that helped Pacific Industries avoid bankruptcy. Martin's comprehensive approach. Each success was attributed to Martin's leadership, with Dana receiving recognition for project management excellence. I received satisfactory performance reviews and cost of living salary adjustments. The message was clear. I was valuable enough to keep, but not valuable enough to acknowledge. I began to realize that my thoroughness was being weaponized against me. Every detailed report I wrote, every comprehensive analysis I provided, every contingency plan I developed, it all became ammunition in Martin's arsenal. He could speak confidently about complex strategies because I'd done the intellectual heavy lifting. He could field difficult questions because I'd anticipated them and provided the answers. The psychological toll was subtle but persistent. I found myself working longer hours, partly because the workload demanded it, but mostly because I couldn't bear to leave knowing that my efforts would be attributed to someone else. I stopped eating lunch with colleagues, not out of antisocial tendencies, but because I couldn't stand the casual conversation about Martin's latest triumph, knowing I'd been the architect behind it. Dana noticed everything. She observed my growing isolation with the keen interest of an anthropologist studying a declining species. She documented my habits, the fact that I brought my own coffee instead of contributing to the office fund, that I rarely participated in after-work social events, that I sometimes worked through lunch breaks. To her, these weren't the behaviors of someone drowning in unrecognized responsibility. They were character flaws that undermined team cohesion. I started receiving emails from Martin about fostering a collaborative environment and the importance of team participation. Dana would schedule mandatory team-building activities during my busiest periods, then note my absence in her reports. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a systematic campaign to frame my dedication as antisocial behavior. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in October. I'd been working on a proposal for Blackstone Manufacturing, a potential client whose account could bring in $5 million annually. The project had consumed 3 weeks of my life. I'd conducted extensive market research, developed a comprehensive competitive analysis, and created a presentation that told a compelling story about transformation and growth. I submitted the proposal to Martin on Monday afternoon. On Tuesday morning, I received an email from him requesting a meeting to discuss areas for improvement in my work. I assumed he wanted to refine the proposal before presenting it to the client. Instead, I walked into his office to find him reviewing a completely different presentation, one that contained all my research, all my insights, all my strategic recommendations, but repackaged as the Martin Rouse Methodology for Industrial Transformation. My work had been absorbed into his personal brand, reduced to a case study in his professional narrative. "I've been thinking about the Blackstone opportunity," he said, not looking up from the presentation. "I believe we can strengthen our position by emphasizing our proven track record with industrial clients. I've developed a methodology that leverages our core competencies while addressing their specific challenges." I stared at him, waiting for some acknowledgement of my contribution. Instead, he continued explaining my own work back to me, using the confident tone of someone who'd never doubted his own expertise. It was performance art at its most absurd, watching a man present my thoughts to me as if they were his own revolutionary insights. "This approach," he said, pointing to a section I'd spent hours perfecting, "demonstrates the kind of innovative thinking that sets us apart from our competitors. I believe it represents the future of strategic consulting." I nodded politely, made a few generic comments about the strength of the proposal, and left his office. I spent the rest of the day in a state of surreal detachment, watching my colleagues from a distance as if I were observing an alien species. These were intelligent people, skilled professionals who understood the complexities of business strategy. Yet they seemed completely oblivious to the fact that Martin was a hollow figure, a mannequin dressed in borrowed brilliance. That evening, I stayed late to finish a report that Martin needed for a client meeting the following day. The office was nearly empty, just the security guard and a few cleaning staff. I was reviewing financial projections when my computer chimed with an incoming email. The sender was Caroline Webb, Director of Operations for Ashcroft Partners. Ashcroft Partners was Silverline's primary competitor in the regional market. They were larger, more established, and significantly more prestigious. I'd always assumed they viewed us as a minor irritation rather than a serious threat. Caroline's email suggested otherwise. Ms. Hamilton, it began. I hope you'll forgive the unusual nature of this communication. I'm writing to express Ashcroft Partners' interest in discussing potential opportunities for collaboration. Your work on the Merrick Industrial's transformation strategy has impressed our team, and we believe your expertise would be valuable to our organization. If you're interested in exploring this conversation, I'd welcome the opportunity to meet at your convenience. Attached to the email was a detailed analysis of Silverline's recent client wins, with specific emphasis on strategic innovations that had driven success. As I read through the document, I felt a chill of recognition. Every innovation, every breakthrough, every creative solution, they were all mine. Ashcroft had been watching, and they'd identified the real source of Silverline's competitive advantage. I stared at the email for a long time, my mind racing through the implications. Someone at Ashcroft had done their homework. They'd looked beyond Martin's polished presentations and Dana's project management credentials to identify the actual architect of Silverline's success. It was both flattering and terrifying. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I spent the next several days in a state of heightened awareness, paying closer attention to the dynamics around me. I noticed how Martin's confidence seemed to waver when forced to answer unexpected questions. I observed how Dana's detailed notes created a paper trail that insulated Martin from accountability. I recognized how my own silence had become a form of armor, protecting me from office politics while making me invisible to recognition. The more I observed, the more I understood that I was trapped in a system designed to exploit my competence while denying my agency. Martin needed me to remain invisible because my visibility would expose his limitations. Dana needed me to remain isolated because my integration would threaten her position as information gatekeeper. The entire structure depended on my willing participation in my own diminishment. A week after receiving Caroline's email, I decided to respond. I suggested meeting at a coffee shop in the downtown business district, far from Silverline's office and the possibility of unwanted observation. Caroline agreed immediately, proposing a time that would allow us to meet during my lunch break. The coffee shop was small and intimate, the kind of place where serious conversations could happen without interruption. Caroline arrived precisely on time, a woman in her early 50s with the kind of understated confidence that comes from genuine authority. She was impeccably dressed, but not flashy. Professional, but not cold. Everything about her demeanor suggested competence without pretension. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said as we settled into a corner booth. "I realize this situation is unusual, but I believe in being direct about opportunities that matter." She ordered a simple coffee, black, which somehow felt significant. No elaborate drinks, no unnecessary complications. Just substance. "I won't insult your intelligence by pretending we don't know who's really driving Silverline's success," she continued. "Your work speaks for itself. The question is whether you're satisfied with the current arrangement." I appreciated her directness. Too often, professional conversations were layered with euphemisms and strategic ambiguity. Caroline was offering clarity. "I'm curious about what you're proposing," I said carefully. She smiled. "I'm proposing that you join a firm that values strategic thinking over strategic positioning. Ashcroft Partners is interested in offering you a senior consultant position with full autonomy over your projects. You'd have your own team, your own client relationships, and your own signature on the work you create." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "The starting salary would be triple your current compensation, with performance bonuses that could double that amount. But more importantly, you'd have the opportunity to build something meaningful rather than simply enabling someone else's mediocrity." The offer was staggering, not just in financial terms, but in the fundamental shift it represented. For 4 years, I'd been the engine powering someone else's career. Caroline was offering me the chance to build my own. I need to ask, I said. How do you know so much about my work at Silverline? Industrial espionage? She laughed. Nothing so dramatic. Your clients talk. When a company like Merrick Industrials sees transformational results, they want to understand how it happened. They ask questions. They want to know who's really responsible for their success. Your name comes up more often than Martin Rouse's. It was a sobering revelation. While I'd been invisible within Silverline, I'd apparently been building a reputation in the broader business community. The people who mattered most, the clients whose problems I'd solved, knew who I was. I'll need time to consider this, I said, though part of me wanted to accept immediately. Of course. But I should mention that this opportunity has a limited window. We're expanding our regional operations, and we need someone with your expertise to lead that expansion. If you're not interested, we'll need to explore other options. She handed me her business card and a sealed envelope. My direct number is on the card. The envelope contains a more detailed proposal, including specific terms and responsibilities. Take your time, but don't take too long. I left the coffee shop with my worldview fundamentally altered. For the first time in years, I had options. I wasn't trapped in a system that undervalued my contributions. I wasn't dependent on Martin's recognition or Dana's approval. I had leverage, but I also had loyalties, or what I thought were loyalties. Silverline had given me my start in strategic consulting. I'd learned valuable lessons there, even if those lessons had come at the cost of recognition. Was I being ungrateful to consider leaving? Was I abandoning my responsibilities to my colleagues? The questions haunted me for the next several days. I found myself analyzing every interaction, every decision, every professional relationship through the lens of Carolyn's offer. I realized that my sense of loyalty was largely one-sided. Silverline had benefited enormously from my work, but they'd given me nothing in return except the opportunity to continue working for their benefit. The tipping point came during a routine team meeting. Martin was presenting our quarterly results to the broader consulting staff, highlighting our success stories and strategic innovations. He spoke with the authority of someone who'd personally architected every victory, describing complex methodologies and breakthrough insights as if they were his own intellectual property. I watched my colleagues' faces as he spoke, seeing their genuine admiration for his apparent expertise. These were intelligent people who respected what they believed was his strategic brilliance. They had no idea they were applauding a performance, not a professional achievement. Dana sat beside Martin, occasionally providing supporting details or clarifying timeline information. She played her role perfectly, the competent assistant who enabled her brilliant supervisor's success. She knew exactly how much credit to claim and how much to attribute to Martin's vision. I sat in the back of the room, taking notes on my own work being presented as someone else's accomplishment. The surreal nature of the situation was overwhelming. I was watching my professional identity being erased in real time, replaced by a narrative that positioned me as a competent but unremarkable contributor to Martin's success. After the meeting, several colleagues approached me with congratulations on being part of such a successful team. They praised Martin's leadership and Dana's organizational skills. No one mentioned my contributions because no one knew they existed. I had become a ghost in my own professional story. That evening, I opened Caroline's envelope and read the detailed proposal. The terms were even more generous than she'd described. The position came with equity participation, comprehensive benefits, and a clear path to partnership. More importantly, it offered the chance to build something meaningful rather than simply enabling someone else's mediocrity. I spent the weekend thinking about the kind of career I wanted to build. I could continue at Silverline, accepting my role as the invisible architect of Martin's success. I could hope that eventually, somehow, my contributions would be recognized and rewarded. Or I could take control of my professional destiny and build something that belonged to me. Monday morning, I decided to test my theory about my value to Silverline. I submitted a proposal for a new client engagement that deliberately contained several strategic flaws. Not dangerous mistakes that would harm the client, but subtle weaknesses that would undermine the proposal's competitive advantage. I wanted to see if Martin would catch the problems or if he would simply present my work without understanding its implications. The proposal went to Martin on Monday afternoon. On Tuesday morning, he forwarded it to the client without modification. The flaws I'd embedded were presented as strategic insights. Martin had no idea that he was submitting substandard work because he'd never understood the quality of work I typically provided. It was a depressing confirmation of what I'd long suspected. Martin wasn't just taking credit for my work, he was completely dependent on it. He lacked the expertise to evaluate strategic proposals, much less create them. His entire professional identity was built on my competence. I spent Tuesday afternoon fixing the proposal and submitting a revised version directly to the client, with a note about additional strategic considerations that had emerged during our internal review. The client accepted the revised proposal enthusiastically, praising the thoroughness of our analysis and the sophistication of our approach. Martin never knew that his initial submission had been flawed. He celebrated the client's acceptance as validation of his strategic vision. Dana added the win to her tracking spreadsheet. Noting Martin's successful client development, I remained invisible, the ghost who had saved Martin from professional embarrassment. That afternoon, I called Caroline Webb. "I'm interested in discussing your offer in more detail," I said. "Excellent. Are you available for dinner tonight? I'd like to introduce you to some members of our executive team." Dinner was at an upscale restaurant in the city's financial district. Caroline had arranged for me to meet with 3 senior partners, each of whom had built their careers on strategic innovation rather than strategic positioning. The conversation was intellectually stimulating in a way that reminded me why I'd chosen consulting as a career. They asked substantive questions about my work, my methodology, my vision for the future of strategic consulting. They listened to my answers with genuine interest, building on my ideas rather than simply waiting for their turn to speak. It was the kind of professional dialogue I'd been craving for years. By the end of the evening, I had a clear understanding of what Ashcroft Partners was offering. It wasn't just a job. It was a chance to build a career that reflected my actual contributions, rather than my willingness to remain invisible. The financial terms were generous, but the real value was in the opportunity to create something meaningful. I accepted their offer that night. With one condition: I wanted to give Silverline 2 weeks' notice. Despite everything, I felt obligated to handle the transition professionally. Carolyn agreed, though she warned me that departure conversations at consulting firms could be complicated. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Martin to discuss my resignation. I'd prepared a brief explanation focused on new opportunities and career growth. I expected the conversation to be awkward but professional. Instead, Martin's response was immediate and hostile. "This is completely unacceptable," he said, his face flushing with indignation. "You're under contract for another 8 months. You can't just abandon your responsibilities because you've received a better offer." I pulled out my employment agreement, which I'd reviewed carefully the night before. My contract specifies 2 weeks' notice for resignation. I'm prepared to fulfill that obligation. 2 weeks isn't sufficient for the transition period. You're involved in multiple active projects. Your departure would create significant disruption for our clients. It was a fascinating moment of cognitive dissonance. Martin was simultaneously arguing that my work was irrelevant enough to go unrecognized and essential enough to prevent my departure. He couldn't have it both ways. "I'm willing to document all active projects and provide detailed transition notes," I offered. "I'll also be available by phone during the transition period to answer questions." "That's not acceptable. I need to discuss this with Dana and review our options." The meeting ended with Martin promising to develop a transition plan that protects our clients' interests. I left his office knowing that the next 2 weeks would be difficult, but confident that I'd made the right decision. I was wrong about the timeline. The difficulties began immediately. Within hours of my meeting with Martin, I received an email from Dana requesting a comprehensive inventory of all my current projects, including client contact information, project timelines, and strategic documentation. The request was framed as transition planning, but the tone suggested something more aggressive. Over the next several days, I found myself subjected to an increasingly hostile work environment. Martin scheduled daily meetings to discuss my transition responsibilities, which seemed designed more to establish a paper trail than to facilitate knowledge transfer. Dana documented every interaction, every deadline, every minor deviation from normal protocol. The psychological pressure was subtle but persistent. I received emails questioning my commitment to client service. I was excluded from meetings related to projects I'd been leading. Colleagues who'd worked with me for years began treating me with professional distance, as if my resignation had somehow betrayed the team. I realized that Martin and Dana were orchestrating a campaign designed to make my departure as difficult as possible. They wanted me to quit immediately, forfeiting my 2-week notice period and leaving them free to characterize my departure as abandonment of responsibility. Alternatively, they wanted to create such a hostile environment that I'd be forced to accept a counteroffer to remain at Silverline. Neither strategy would work. I was committed to handling my departure professionally, regardless of their behavior. I documented every interaction, maintained detailed records of all transition activities, and continued to meet my obligations to existing clients. I wouldn't give them legitimate grounds to question my professionalism. The breaking point came during my final week at Silverline. I was called into a conference room for what Martin described as a comprehensive evaluation of transition readiness. I expected to meet with Martin and Dana to review outstanding projects and finalize knowledge transfer procedures. Instead, I walked into a room containing 18 of my colleagues, Martin and Dana. The atmosphere was tense, almost ceremonial. Martin sat at the head of the table with a thick folder in front of him. Dana had her ever-present notebook, already filled with several pages of notes. "Thank you all for joining us," Martin began, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone delivering prepared remarks. "We're here to discuss concerns that have been raised about workplace dynamics and team cohesion. As you know, we've been experiencing some challenges related to collaborative effectiveness." I felt a chill of recognition. This wasn't a transition meeting, it was a tribunal. Martin and Dana had assembled an audience for what appeared to be a public disciplinary action. Over the past several weeks, we've been documenting behavioral patterns that may be impacting team morale and operational efficiency. Martin continued, "Dana has compiled a comprehensive analysis of these concerns, which we believe need to be addressed before we can move forward with transition planning." Dana opened her notebook and began reading from what appeared to be a carefully prepared list. "We've identified 190 specific instances of behavior that undermines team cohesion and workplace culture. 190. They had cataloged 190 reasons why I was supposedly unfit for the workplace. The absurdity of the number was almost comical, but the atmosphere in the room was deadly serious. Instance number 1, Dana continued, "Bringing personal coffee to work instead of contributing to the office coffee fund, demonstrating lack of commitment to shared resources." I stared at her in disbelief. They were criticizing me for bringing my own coffee to work. Instance number 2, consistently eating lunch alone instead of participating in team meal activities, indicating antisocial tendencies that undermine group dynamics. The list continued with similarly trivial complaints. I was criticized for working late, which apparently made colleagues feel guilty about their own schedules. I was criticized for asking detailed questions during meetings, which supposedly demonstrated lack of trust in team expertise. I was criticized for taking comprehensive notes, which indicated an unwillingness to rely on collective memory. Every habit, every preference, every professional behavior had been reframed as evidence of my unsuitability for teamwork. Dana read each item with the mechanical precision of someone performing a rehearsed script. Martin nodded gravely at each point, playing the role of the concerned supervisor forced to address difficult personnel issues. My colleagues sat in uncomfortable silence, clearly uncertain about what they were witnessing. Some stared at their hands, others glanced nervously between Martin and me. No one spoke in my defense, but no one seemed comfortable with the proceedings either. As Dana reached item number 50, then 75, then 100, I felt a strange sense of detachment. I was watching my professional identity being systematically dismantled by people who had never understood my contributions. They were criticizing me for the same behaviors that had enabled their success. By item 125, I had stopped listening to the specific complaints. Instead, I focused on the broader dynamic. Martin needed this public performance to justify my departure and protect his position. Dana needed it to demonstrate her value as his information-gathering apparatus. They had turned my resignation into a morality play about the importance of team conformity. When Dana finally reached item 190, demonstrating insufficient enthusiasm during team-building activities, the room fell silent. Martin looked around the table with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully made his point. "As you can see," he said, "we've been dealing with significant challenges related to workplace culture and team dynamics. These issues need to be addressed before we can move forward with any transition planning." The implication was clear. I was being given an ultimatum: conform to their behavioral expectations or forfeit my right to a professional departure. They wanted me to apologize, to acknowledge the validity of their complaints, to accept their characterization of my behavior as problematic. I looked around the room at my colleagues, people I'd worked with for years, people whose projects I'd saved and whose careers I'd supported. They avoided eye contact, unwilling to challenge Martin's narrative, but also unwilling to endorse it. For a moment, I considered defending myself. I could have pointed out the absurdity of their complaints, the professional success we'd achieved together, the projects I'd led and problems I'd solved. I could have reminded them of specific instances where my work had prevented disasters or created opportunities. Instead, I reached for my phone. "Thank you for the comprehensive feedback," I said, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. "I appreciate the thoroughness of your documentation." I dialed Caroline Webb's direct number. She answered on the second ring. "Caroline, it's Claire Hamilton. I'm ready to accept your offer. Effective immediately." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Martin's face went pale as he realized what was happening. Dana stopped writing in her notebook, her pen frozen mid-sentence. "Excellent," Carolyn said, her voice warm with approval. "I'll have our HR department prepare the paperwork. Can you start Monday?" "I'll be there," I said, then hung up the phone. I stood up, gathering my notebook and purse. "I'll send transition documents for all active projects by end of business today. My resignation is effective immediately." I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to address the room. "For what it's worth," I said, "I hope you find someone who appreciates the coffee fund as much as you do." I left the conference room, collected my personal items from my desk, and walked out of Silverline Consulting for the last time. Behind me, I could hear the confused buzz of conversation as my colleagues tried to process what they'd witnessed. I felt oddly calm as I drove away from the office. 4 years of my professional life had just ended with a surreal, theatrical performance, but I felt liberated rather than angry. Martin and Dana had finally shown their true colors, and I was free to build something better. That afternoon, I received a phone call from James Merrick, CEO of Merrick Industrials. He'd heard about my departure from Silverline and wanted to discuss the possibility of continuing our working relationship through my new firm. "I'll be honest with you, Claire," he said. "We've been working with Silverline because we thought Martin Rouse was the strategic genius behind your success. But over the past year, it's become clear that you're the real architect of the transformation we've experienced. We'd like to explore how we can work with you directly." It was the first of many such calls. Over the next several days, I heard from clients representing more than half of Silverline's revenue base. They weren't interested in maintaining relationships with Martin and Dana. They wanted to work with the person who had actually solved their problems. Monday morning, I walked into Ashcroft Partners' downtown office as their new Senior Director of Strategic Innovation. Caroline had arranged for me to have a corner office with a view of the city, a small team of junior analysts, and complete autonomy over my client relationships. The nameplate on my door read, "Claire Hamilton, Senior Director." It was the first time in 4 years that my name had appeared on anything related to my professional work. My first week at Ashcroft was a revelation. I attended meetings where my opinions were solicited and valued. I worked on projects where my contributions were acknowledged and credited. I participated in strategic planning sessions where my expertise was recognized rather than appropriated. Caroline introduced me to the firm's partners as the strategic mind behind Silverline's recent success. There was no ambiguity about my role or my contributions. I was finally working in an environment where competence was rewarded rather than exploited. Within a month, I had signed 3 major clients who had followed me from Silverline. Within 6 months, I was leading a team of 12 analysts and managing a portfolio worth $15 million annually. Within a year, I was promoted to managing director with equity participation in the firm. I never spoke publicly about my experience at Silverline. I didn't need to seek revenge or vindication. My success at Ashcroft Partners was revenge enough. I had built something meaningful, something that belonged to me, something that reflected my actual contributions rather than my willingness to remain invisible. Occasionally, I heard updates about Silverline through industry connections. Martin had struggled to replace the strategic capabilities I'd provided. Several major clients had terminated their relationships with the firm. Dana had been forced to take on additional responsibilities as the company downsized. I felt no satisfaction in their difficulties. I'd moved beyond the need for their failure to validate my success. I was building something positive rather than simply escaping something negative. 3 years after leaving Silverline, I received an unexpected phone call from Dana Morrison. She was calling to apologize for her role in my departure and to ask for career advice. She'd been laid off from Silverline as part of a broader restructuring and was struggling to find new employment. "I realize now that I made a mistake," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I should have recognized your contributions instead of undermining them. I was so focused on protecting Martin's position that I didn't consider the damage I was causing to the team." I listened to her apology with a mixture of empathy and detachment. She sounded genuinely remorseful, but her regret seemed motivated more by professional desperation than moral clarity. She wanted my help because she needed a job, not because she understood the ethical implications of her behavior. "I appreciate your honesty," I said. "I hope you find a situation that's a better fit for your skills and values." I didn't offer to help her find new employment. Some bridges, once burned, aren't worth rebuilding. I wished her well and ended the call. Martin never contacted me directly, but I heard through mutual connections that he'd taken a position with a smaller consulting firm at a significant reduction in salary and responsibility. Without my strategic capabilities to support his reputation, he'd been forced to accept a role that better matched his actual qualifications. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy about his situation. Martin had made his choices, and I had made mine. We were both living with the consequences. Today, I lead a team of 35 strategic consultants at Ashcroft Partners. My name appears on the firm's website as a managing director and partner. I've been featured in industry publications as an expert on organizational transformation. I speak at conferences about strategic innovation and business development. More importantly, I've built a professional environment where competence is recognized and rewarded. My team members know that their contributions matter, that their work will be acknowledged, and that their careers are built on their actual achievements, rather than their willingness to remain invisible. I still work long hours, but now I work for myself rather than for someone else's benefit. I still solve complex problems, but now I receive credit for the solutions I develop. I still build relationships with clients, but now those relationships are based on my expertise rather than someone else's appropriation of my work. The nameplate on my office door hasn't changed in 3 years. It still reads, Claire Hamilton, Managing Director. But it represents something far more significant than a job title. It represents the end of my invisibility and the beginning of my professional identity. I learned that loyalty without recognition is exploitation, that competence without acknowledgement is servitude, and that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is to stop enabling other people's mediocrity. I learned that building something meaningful requires the courage to claim what's yours and the wisdom to know when to walk away. Most importantly, I learned that ghosts don't have to remain invisible forever. Sometimes they can choose to become visible, to build something real, to create a legacy that belongs to them rather than to the people who pretended to conjure their magic. The 190 reasons why I should have been fired became the foundation for everything I built afterward. Each trivial complaint, each petty criticism, each attempt to diminish my contributions became evidence of my incompatibility with mediocrity. I wasn't unsuited for teamwork, I was unsuited for exploitation. I never thanked Martin and Dana for their comprehensive documentation of my professional sins, but in a way, they gave me the greatest gift of my career: absolute clarity about who I was and what I was worth. They showed me that I deserved better than invisible excellence, better than unrecognized contribution, better than a professional life spent enabling someone else's success. The phone call that changed everything lasted less than 30 seconds, but it marked the end of 4 years of professional invisibility and the beginning of a career that finally belonged to me. Sometimes the most important decisions are the simplest ones. The decision to stop accepting less than you deserve. The decision to build something that reflects your actual worth. The decision to make yourself visible in a world that profits from your invisibility. I made that decision in a conference room full of people who had never understood my value. I made it in front of colleagues who had never recognized my contributions. I made it while listening to a list of 190 reasons why I was supposedly unfit for their workplace. It was the best decision I ever made.